We're joined now by Nat Keohane. He is president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Nat, just want to get your first reaction to this conference that is still going on as we speak. What are you expecting here?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'll start by saying the conference opened, and for the first really week and a half, I think it was very positive, lots of optimism. It opened with leaders making really important pledges and announcements that combined public and private cooperation. So we can come back to that, but the general tone, I think, in Glasgow was one of optimism. Now we do see it going into the final hours. I don't think, frankly, anybody who has been around these conferences before was surprised to see it go past the deadline. A new draft of the final decision is due tomorrow morning, Glasgow time, and the presidency has said they will wrap it up tomorrow afternoon. Key issues that remain, you mentioned them just now, that covered text, that covered decision that talks about things like phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and coal. There are some questions about that, but also questions about what you can think of as the operational issues, guidance around the Article 6 that governs international cooperation, and the issues of finance and loss and damage that you also mentioned. So those are the things that I think remain to be finalized in the hours between now and whenever the final gavel goes down.
It still seems like they're far apart. Now, there's a sense of urgency more than ever before. What is the reality of implementing everything that does get agreed upon, since none of it is really legally binding? We have seen this all before.
Well, I'm on two minds. On the one hand, I think we should underscore the progress we've seen. You know, if you go back to 2014, before the Paris Agreement, forecasts of global heating were that we were on track to be at 3.7, nearly 4 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. The Paris pledges, the first round back in 2014, brought that down from 3.7 to 2.7 degrees. And the latest estimates with the updated targets for this conference suggest we're down at 2.4 degrees. And if the long-term targets like net zero targets for mid-century are met, we're under 2 degrees. Now that's just pledges, but it gives you a sense of the progress we've made in the ambition of the targets. Now what's really critical, as you mentioned, is that we start delivering on those targets. They aren't legally binding in the sense there's no enforcement mechanism in international law, but we are seeing countries start to put policies in place, and it's going to be important that they continue to really put in place the policies and measures to meet those more ambitious targets. That's where the focus needs to be in the next few years. We generally know how to do it. We know what kind of policies and what kind of actions countries need to take to cut their emissions. And it's a matter of translating those targets into the policies that will make a difference on the ground.
You touched on this a moment ago, but the financial part of all of this, the numbers, many there in Glasgow are still asking for richer countries to give more. How realistic are those goals, given that many of the developing countries and really everywhere around the world, everyone is still struggling with the pandemic?
Well, there are sort of two issues here when it comes to the financing the transition, but also financing greater resilience. And they go under two different names in the talks. One of them is just long-term finance. And you'll hear about this pledge that developed countries led by the United States made back in Copenhagen in 2009 to mobilize $100 billion per year in climate aid to developing countries, both from public and private sources. The best estimates are that those countries are still falling short. There was a 2020 date for that. Countries are still falling short, and there's now talk, well, can we mobilize that in the next few years? That $100 billion will probably be met within the next couple of years, but in some senses, it's much smaller than the trillions of dollars that we actually need to mobilize in private capital to really provide, get through this clean energy transition to net zero. There's a second issue which is called loss and damage, and that's a little bit more contentious, and that concerns whether the rich countries that have put most of the pollution into the atmosphere should be compensating the really poorer, most vulnerable countries, small island states that face an existential crisis from climate change. That's something I think these talks have made progress on, but there's still going to be more work to be done coming out of Glasgow.